No, we were passionate, without question, about getting something great. But I think, we were both awkward buggers, difficult sorts. So it was some of that personality as well.
It was a difficult period. There were some great moments and some awful moments, to be honest, during the writing period of this and everything. But then once we started playing on the road, it got a bit, once you started this audience response, it all started to sort of, make sense a little bit, really.
My parents, bless them, are supportive. I mean, if you see your children really keen to do something, I think you have to support it. I'm sure they're hoping that it wouldn't last, I'd grow out of it. But because in all fairness, in those days, as parents, there was no possible conception that you could have a career making this kind of music, pop music. They hadn't really seen that. And so, in a sense, supporting, I think that they were very good and very brave in that way, I think.
There was parental pressure, and in fact, John Silver, who'd been the drummer after Chris Stewart, and is a wonderful guy, and had, as was Chris, but John had actually been very good at encouraging us to develop sort of an individual personality and to push the folk thing. I mean, he was a sort of jazz fan, really, in lots of ways, and he dropped out definitely because of parental pressure, and he ended up, at Cornell University in America, and he said afterwards he was sort of still hoping he'd get the letter welcoming him or inviting him back, whereas we just thought, okay, well, that's what he's decided to do. Fair enough, he's off. And with John was much more of a professional musician who'd actually played with real bands of musicians rather than a bunch of songwriters, pretending to be a group. And so he had sort of different sets of experiences, and I think he was having a difficult period in that time, and he worked really hard and was very dedicated and delivered, I think, well in some places, but it still felt a bit of a struggle. Just on the drum side of it, I mean, Ant was the other person who was also drum sensitive, so I think he and I sort of overlapped in some of those areas, but between us, we would have a lot of ideas for what the drum parts should do, in much the same way that I think, Paul McCartney did with Ringo. And obviously, as soon as Phil came along, that role was unnecessary.
I went to university for a year, in fact, and then sort of took a year off and then took another year off. And I think my parents always hoped I'd go back. And I knew that I felt this was an opportunity that would only come. You get opportunities, it was one that was there. And I thought about not doing it, and then I thought I really would miss this. I really, really want to do this as a chance, and at that time it was an incredibly slim chance, as you must understand. And so we just sort of slowly, we were able to do it. I think back in that period of time, 1970, there were an awful lot of clubs and things you could play where a band like us could just play support probably to some other group, in front of maybe 80, 90 people, maybe less or less, When we headlined, we were playing to sort of, sometimes a little sort of 5 or 6 people. I mean, that's what you were doing, But you had a chance to learn your craft, and you could actually, you just about could get enough money to keep yourself going.
Many people have been puzzled how the hell we did so well and how the hell we survived for so long, when in a lot of critics' eyes, the music is unlistenable. So, and I actually think that it's because it's based on songwriters, and obviously we built a very strong fan base playing live, and I think it was those two things. But if you look at, say, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, 10cc, other bands which are songwriter-based rather than musician-based, I think you do see sort of long lifespans, maybe, or not all in the same direction, but it's a different sensibility. Most bands begin, playing together and then find writing, whereas we wanted to write and we found playing.
People never realise that in a way, I think, apart from Peter, who was always very get up and go with agents and managers and the business side, in many ways that first era, Ant was the strongest driving force. Extrovert on stage, musically he was very strong, I think. So the concept that he might leave was probably nowhere near in our thoughts at all.
In many ways, Ant was the most musically gifted, I think, of all of us, and it was, I think, a great loss when he didn't sort of continue on beyond that. I mean, he was also the most obsessive, I think, in a lot of ways, and some of that culture, I think, grew quite unhealthy. That a life was not a concept that the band would sort of consider or allow beyond what we were doing. It was a bit like joining the army, and it wasn't really from an authoritarian sort of point of view. There was just this really powerful group mentality that it had to be 100% total commitment, and that, I think, also has its cost. And although I think Ant was very uncomfortable playing live, and that was part of it, but it was also, I think, extremely stressful, and in part it was self-imposed and then group-imposed stress.
Anthony, for me, was kind of the group leader. He was the one who wanted to go live. He was the one who wanted to go professional. He kind of motivated the rest of us really to do that. Peter and I were not sure at all that's what we really wanted to do, but he was the one who wanted to do it. And initially, I think we almost stayed. The first summer we started doing this. We did it because we were a four, and we sort of did it before with the intention that we probably wouldn't stay and they would find somebody else. And then of course we got more into it and everything after that. So we were very surprised. Then Anthony was the one who sort of seemed to suffer from stage fright and everything, and that kind of, in a sense, was sort of perhaps ultimately the reason why he left. But there was no feeling that he was going to leave at this point. So it was a very sort of difficult thing. And I mean, at this point, we were very definitely looking ahead, for that this was the group.
Well, that was nothing to do with the music. It was just to do with the sort of stage fright and sort of things that just health, really. I just had kind of, found it really tough. I'd started well and then come unstuck, really. That's why I was saying, on the album I was pretty much sort of on autopilot, because these things had already happened. So the recording, in a sense, was quite pleasant for me because there was no sort of huge pressure. Because I'd sort of internally put myself under huge pressure on the road. I mean, you might have thought that being in Trident Studios was a huge, but I didn't sort of see it that way. It was kind of very pleasant. No, that was all to do. It wasn't. There was nothing. There was no sort of kind of left for musical differences or huge personality clashes. No, I just found the touring had taken a huge kind of toll, really.
I'm conscious now, having just finished this book we've done, and hearing his side of things, I was kind of saddened that I didn't quite clock what was going on. We were very close, Ant and I, and I think at this stage I had a girlfriend and we saw each other less, and I kind of drifted away a bit, and I wasn't really aware just quite how bad his stage fright was, and he had glandular fever. I know he was run down and everything, but I didn't quite. I'd have thought that I'd know him so well, I would have really been able to get picked up what was going on, but I often miss things. But I didn't. So in a sense, it was a shock when he told us. In those days, for the first 2 or 3 albums, we had Paul Whitehead, who was a good artist who kind of, at the time, was involved in doing album covers and stuff. And so you kind of, and also there's that nice gatefold sleeve which you don't have anymore. So you kind of let him go. I mean, you let someone go away and do something quite that excites them, and then see what you got. And he looked great with the big sort of knife slash across, I thought.
Well, that was quite a nice idea. We saw the music we'd done. A lot of it was very sort of pretty and romantic music. We had this one song, The Knife, which was anything but, a sort of violent song. So we just pictorially did that. We said to this guy, just draw a fairy drawing and then knife slash through the middle with a knife sticking out the end of it. And it was sort of, I think it's quite good, really, because it's deceptive, Genesis, sometimes. You sort of see them as one thing, but in fact there's this other thing going on right from the early days, I think. And we've always had those two sides to us, sort of, it may vary a little bit, really, as to how you define them, but the sort of romantic side and the sort of more aggressive side, it's a very important part of what we do. And so I thought that particular cover actually was really good, because it was it was supposed to be a kind of like a cliched sort of fairy story kind of like cover, and then with this knife on it, which did something special, I think. Best of the early covers, I think, in many ways. Well, best of the first 3 covers, anyhow.
We talked to Paul at some length, and he heard some of this sort of folky stuff and mythical bits, and I just felt it was getting too twee, so I suggested that we get a big knife and slash it, which fortunately, there was a lot of discussion about this in the band, but in the end they went for it, whereas I was going to go for quite a crude knife. I think Paul in the end chose this sort of more elegant dagger, which wasn't quite what I'd had in mind, but I think it did a job, and for fans, so it had again its own personality, which is what we wanted.
I think it seemed to be a pretty good compromise between the kind of folky sort of tendency towards slightly sort of medieval echoes of, and then there's the sort of harder edge stuff. So, and you want to draw someone's attention as well. So a great way of combining it is you've got one thing which is a sort of the characters plus this knife slash, which might look a bit OTT and grotesque to some people, but it seems to me to be a pretty good reflection. And you can see commercially why that was a good move.
Well, Trespass was a big advance for us from Genesis Revelation. We'd been playing live for a while, and I think it was the first album where we start to play as a group. We actually know what we're doing, and everything sort of starts to coalesce, really. It's in its position in the Genesis thing, it was very important. It was a kind of like, because it set the trend, I think, of what was to come later. It's definitely the first of the Genesis albums as people came to know them, and from that point of view, it's very important. I think we still had a bit to learn, and I think 1 or 2 of the songs in there, perhaps a little bit slight in comparison with what was to come later. But at its strongest moments, which, as I said before, I think Stagnation, I think it's right up there.
I think it was a good start. There was definitely a personality that was different to other bands and prog bands at the time. So it was the first thing, I think, to set us apart. And we had, I think some minor success in Belgium, which felt like conquering the world at the time.
I would think of sort of a very good early Genesis album. Obviously, there's many better later.
I'd describe it as our first album as a proper band. That's how it felt. We'd become a band and made an album. We haven't heard it for 30 years or 20 years, so actually you go back and you kind of often reevaluate and go, well, that's really quite nice.